She did not raise her voice. That more than anything unsettled them. On a quiet street in Orange County, beneath a sky that had not yet decided whether it would darken or remain indifferent, Dominic Hale stood in the doorway of a house legally shared, but in his mind no longer hers. "You've lived here long enough without contributing," he said, not loudly, but with the kind of certainty that invites witnesses. Across the street, curtains shifted. A car slowed, then moved on. At Greta Halvorson's feet sat a suitcase she had not packed. The lock clicked clean, irreversible. She did not reach for the handle again, because somewhere far beyond that door, ownership had already changed hands, and Dominic had just removed the one person who no longer needed his permission to exist. If you've ever seen quiet strength mistaken for weakness, stay with this story. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and if you believe that dignity doesn't need noise to be powerful, consider subscribing. Stories like this don't unfold all at once, but they always reveal what matters. There are people who build their lives out of motion, constant, visible, undeniable motion. And there are those who build theirs out of structure, quiet and unseen, held together not by attention but by consistency. Greta Halvorson had always belonged to the latter. Long before anyone questioned her presence in a room, she had already learned how to exist without requiring acknowledgement. Not as absence, but as precision. She did not need to be noticed in order to understand what was happening around her. In fact, she understood more when she wasn't. Her work reflected that. She was employed by a legal compliance and archival firm in Irvine, a place where documents passed through multiple hands before being considered complete, yet still required someone to ensure that completion meant something. Greta was that person. She did not create the documents, nor did she present them. She examined them quietly, methodically, ensuring that what had been signed matched what had been agreed upon, and that what had been recorded could withstand scrutiny long after the people involved had moved on. It was work that required patience more than speed, accuracy more than confidence. Dominic Hale, her husband, rarely described it that way. To him, Greta's job existed somewhere beneath visibility, a function rather than a profession. When asked about her, he would often say with a lightness that passed for humor, "She deals with paperwork, keeps things organized." It was not inaccurate. It was not complete. Greta never corrected him. In the early years of their marriage, there had been a balance, imperfect but functional. Dominic moved outward into the world with ease, his voice carrying across rooms, his presence opening doors that might have remained closed to someone less certain of their own place within them. He worked in real estate, a field that rewarded persuasion, timing, and the ability to present opportunity as inevitability. Greta, meanwhile, maintained what existed beneath that surface. She tracked their finances with a consistency that bordered on ritual. Every deposit, every expense, every adjustment, nothing escaped her attention. She ensured their taxes were filed correctly, their accounts reconciled, their obligations met before they became problems. Dominic had once recognized this, though not in language that would last. "You make everything run," he told her early on in a moment that felt unguarded. "I just bring in the deals." At the time, it had sounded like appreciation. Over time, it became something else. The shift did not arrive as conflict. It arrived as omission. Small decisions made without consultation. Financial adjustments introduced after the fact. A tone subtle, almost dismissible, that suggested explanation was no longer necessary. At first, Greta noticed it the way she noticed discrepancies in documents, not as a problem but as a deviation. A new credit account opened without discussion. A transfer from their joint savings into an investment she had not reviewed. A subscription service tied to a business expense that did not appear in any formal record. Each instance on its own could be explained. Context could be supplied. Intent could be clarified. But Greta did not rely on explanation. She relied on pattern. And patterns, once they begin to form, do not require interpretation to be recognized. She did not confront Dominic immediately. Confrontation, in her experience, often replaced clarity with noise. People spoke more when challenged, but not always more accurately. Instead, she began to document. Not because she anticipated needing the information, but because she understood that memory, especially shared memory, had a tendency to shift under pressure. She created a folder. It did not carry a dramatic title, just household financial notes. Inside, she saved statements, screenshots, confirmation emails. She noted dates, times, and descriptions exactly as they appeared without commentary. Where something seemed inconsistent, she did not label it as such. She simply placed it alongside related entries and allowed the alignment or lack of it to speak for itself. Dominic did not notice. There was no reason for him to. Greta's behavior had not changed in any way that would invite attention. She still asked neutral questions when necessary, still maintained the rhythms of their shared life, still responded without visible resistance. But she had stopped assuming that shared meant understood. One evening, that distinction became clearer. They were seated at the dining table, a laptop open between them, the soft glow of the screen illuminating a spreadsheet Greta had maintained for years. It was not complex, but it was complete income, expenses, projections, all arranged in a way that allowed for clarity without explanation. Greta pointed to a line item. "This wasn't here last month," she said, her tone even observational. Dominic glanced at it briefly, then leaned back. "It's taken care of." "What is it?" "A business expense. It's coming from the joint account." A pause followed, not long, but long enough to mark a shift. Then Dominic spoke, his voice steady, almost casual. "Greta, you don't contribute to that account." The sentence settled into the space between them with a quiet finality. It did not rise in volume. It did not sharpen in tone. It simply replaced something that had previously been understood as shared with something newly defined as separate. Greta did not react immediately. She looked at the spreadsheet again, then at the deposit history, her salary consistent over time, routed into the same account without interruption. The record was clear. Dominic's statement was also clear. But they did not align. Greta closed the laptop. "Okay," she said. It was not agreement. It was acknowledgement of what had been said and of what it revealed. That night she updated her records. She wrote the sentence exactly as Dominic had spoken it. No paraphrasing. No interpretation. She attached supporting documentation, income records, bank statements, tax filings, placing them alongside the entry not as rebuttal but as context. Because over time, the relationship between what is said and what is documented becomes increasingly significant. Dominic, meanwhile, continued as he always had. He spoke of new clients, new opportunities, shifting markets. His confidence remained intact, his narratives consistent within themselves, even when they did not align with external verification. Greta listened. And when she could, she verified. Public property records became a quiet reference point. County filings listing histories, permit approvals information that existed outside of Dominic's telling of events unaffected by presentation or intention. Sometimes his accounts matched. Sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, Greta did not correct him. She saved both versions. There was no urgency in this process, no immediate consequence, just accumulation. Weeks passed in this manner each day, adding small, precise entries to a system that existed entirely within Greta's control. Dominic began staying out later. At first, it was framed as necessity client dinners, networking events, opportunities that required presence beyond standard hours. Greta did not question the explanation. She noted the frequency. 3 nights in 1 week, then 4. Then an inconsistency in timing departures that did not align with scheduled meetings, returns that extended beyond what the stated context required. She did not label it as anything. Not yet, because labeling introduces conclusion. And Greta was not interested in conclusion without structure. She was interested in alignment. One night, as Dominic spoke about a potential development in San Diego early stage, he described it with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested proximity to success. Greta listened without interruption. Later, after he had gone to sleep, she searched. The development existed, but it was not early stage, and it was not accessible to someone in Dominic's position. She saved the listing, placed it alongside his statement. No comment, no judgment, just placement. Because eventually, when enough pieces exist within the same frame, they begin to define their own meaning. Greta did not rush that process. She allowed it to unfold, quietly, completely, without interference, because she understood something Dominic did not yet recognize, that the difference between what is claimed and what is real does not need to be argued. It only needs to be preserved. And Greta Halvorson had always been very good at preservation. The call did not arrive with urgency, though the information it carried could have justified it. It came at 8:57 a.m., while Greta Halvorson was seated at her desk reviewing a set of internal disclosures that had already passed through 2 departments without anyone noticing that the dates did not align. The discrepancy was minor, almost invisible, unless someone was looking for it, which of course Greta was. Her phone vibrated once against the wood surface. She glanced at the number. New York. Not saved. She let it ring a second time, not out of hesitation, but to finish the line she was reading. It was a habit she had developed over years, complete one unit of attention before allowing another to enter. On the third ring she answered, Greta Halvorson. The voice on the other end was composed, deliberate, and structured in a way that suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. Miss Halvorson, this is Daniel Reeves, calling from Whitaker, Shaw & Briggs in Manhattan. I'm contacting you regarding Miss Eleanor Halvorson. There are moments in which a name carries more weight than the sentence that surrounds it. This was one of them. Greta did not shift in her chair. Yes. A pause followed, not uncertainty but sequencing, as though the caller was aligning his words with a protocol already in place. I'm sorry to inform you that Miss Halvorson passed away earlier this morning. The statement was clear, unembellished, and final. Greta lowered her pen onto the desk. Time, she asked. Approximately 4:20 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Cause natural. There were no complications reported. She wrote it down. Date. Time. Cause. Not because she needed to remember, but because recording established the event within a system that could be referenced later untouched by interpretation. Daniel Reeves continued. You are listed as the primary beneficiary and designated party for estate proceedings. There are documents that require your presence in New York within the next few days. I can be there tomorrow. That would be ideal. We will arrange. That won't be necessary. A brief pause recalibrated. Understood. There are additional matters tied to the estate that are best discussed in person. I understand. The call ended without further exchange. Greta remained seated for a moment longer, not in stillness but in transition, allowing the information to settle into its proper place. Eleanor Halvorson was no longer alive. The sentence existed now, not as possibility, not as anticipation, as fact. Greta did not cry. Grief for her was not absent, it was deferred, structured, contained within a space that would not interfere with what needed to be done. She opened a new document. Eleanor Halvorson Estate. She entered the details exactly as given. No adjectives, no qualifiers. Then she booked a flight. One way. Return would depend on what the documents required. Dominic Hale was in the kitchen when she returned home that evening, leaning against the counter with his phone angled slightly away from view, as though whatever occupied his attention required a degree of privacy not formally acknowledged. Hey, he said, glancing up briefly. You're back early. I'm leaving tomorrow. That was enough to redirect his attention. For work? No. My aunt passed away this morning. Dominic's expression shifted not into grief but into recognition of context. Oh, I didn't know she was sick. She wasn't. A small pause followed, during which Dominic processed the information, not for its emotional weight, but for its implications. So, you're going to New York? Yes. For how long, I don't know yet. He nodded, then asked with a tone that remained casual but precise. She had money right. Greta looked at him. Yes. Another pause. Did she leave you anything? I haven't reviewed the documents yet. Dominic exhaled softly, as though aligning expectation with uncertainty. Well, hopefully it's something useful. The words settled between them. Useful. Not meaningful. Not significant. Useful. Greta did not respond. She moved past him down the hallway toward the bedroom where she would pack. Dominic's attention returned to his phone before she reached the door. Text me when you land, he said, almost as an afterthought. I will. She didn't. The flight to New York was uneventful, which suited Greta. She spent most of it reviewing what little she knew about Eleanor's affairs, not through memory but through publicly accessible records that had always existed, though she had never had reason to examine them closely. Halvorson and Blythe Holdings. The name appeared repeatedly in corporate filings, always positioned slightly behind more visible entities, as though it preferred to operate without drawing attention to itself. Real estate. Commercial. Multi-state. Long-term assets. Greta had noticed the pattern years ago, but had not pursued it. Eleanor had never offered explanation, and Greta had never required one. Their relationship had been defined not by disclosure, but by understanding. Eleanor had raised Greta for several years during a period when stability had been intermittent at best. She had not offered comfort in the traditional sense, Nor had she softened expectations to accommodate uncertainty. Instead, she had provided structure. Do not assume clarity where none has been verified, Eleanor had told her once standing in an office that contained more files than furniture. People rely on assumption because it is faster than confirmation. That is why they are often wrong. Greta had not forgotten that. Now, as the plane descended, the memory did not feel distant. It felt instructional. New York did not pause for arrival. The city continued, as it always had, efficient, indifferent, structured in a way that did not require acknowledgement of individual circumstance. Greta moved through it without resistance. A car took her from the airport to a hotel that had already been arranged, though she had not requested it. That detail, more than any formal statement, suggested scale. The next morning she arrived at Whitaker, Shaw and Briggs at precisely 9:00 a.m. The building was unremarkable from the outside. Inside it was exact. Controlled lighting, minimal sound, surfaces arranged with intentional alignment. A receptionist greeted her by name. "Miss Halvorson, Mr. Reeves is expecting you." Of course he was. She was escorted to a conference room where 3 individuals were already seated. Daniel Reeves stood. "Miss Halvorson, thank you for coming." She nodded. Introductions followed. Daniel Reeves, estate attorney. Margaret Lynn, financial counsel. Thomas Berger, corporate structuring specialist. Not a standard estate team, Greta noticed. She took her seat. A folder had been placed in front of her. Thick, ordered, unlabeled on the outside. Daniel began. "This is the formal reading of Miss Eleanor Halvorson's will." The language that followed was procedural at first. Identity revocation of prior documents, confirmation of sound mind, then distribution. Minor allocations were listed: charitable foundations, long-standing associates. Then, the entirety of the remaining estate, including all controlling interests in Halvorson and Blythe Holdings and its subsidiary entities, is hereby transferred to Greta Elise Halvorson. The room remained unchanged. No one reacted. They did not need to. Greta read the line once, then again. Not for confirmation, for precision. Margaret Lynn spoke next. "In summary, Halvorson and Blythe Holdings currently manages assets valued at approximately $50 billion distributed across multiple markets." The number entered the structure of the room without altering it. 50 billion. Not as abstraction, as documentation. Greta closed the folder. Not abruptly, deliberately. "Timeline?" she asked. Thomas Berger answered. "Transfer procedures begin immediately. Full operational authority transitions within 30 to 60 days, pending regulatory clearance. Public disclosure deferred until initial transfer is secured." Greta nodded. "No announcements before that." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "That can be arranged." There was a pause. Not uncertain, complete. Greta looked at the folder again. Not as inheritance, as system. Because she understood something at that moment with complete clarity. Nothing about this changed who she was. It changed what she was responsible for. And responsibility to Greta Halvorson had always begun the same way, with documentation. The number 50 billion did not linger in Greta Halvorson's mind as a measure of wealth, nor did it reshape her sense of self in any immediate or visible way. It settled instead into a different category entirely: responsibility scale, and the quiet weight of something that would not tolerate carelessness. The meeting did not pause after it was spoken. There was no ceremonial silence, no acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just been transferred across a table in a room that seemed intentionally designed to absorb impact without reflecting it. Daniel Reeves continued, his tone unchanged. "We'll proceed with structural overview," he said, as though outlining the next step in a process that had already begun long before Greta arrived. Margaret Lynn slid a binder toward her. Unlike the will, this one was labeled Halvorson and Blythe Holdings Structural Summary. Greta opened it. Inside there was no narrative, only architecture. Ownership trees mapped across multiple states, each branch extending into subsidiaries that operated with varying degrees of autonomy. Revenue streams were broken down by sector, not in broad estimates but in precise allocations. Leasing portfolios, development pipelines, tax exposures, debt instruments. Everything was arranged in a way that suggested not only control but continuity. This was not something that had been assembled quickly. It had been constructed, maintained, protected. Margaret began to explain, but Greta was already reading. Primary holdings are concentrated in New York, Illinois, California, and Washington, she said, turning a page. Secondary expansion in Texas and Colorado. Portfolio diversification leans toward long-term commercial stability rather than short-term speculative growth. Greta's eyes moved steadily, absorbing without interruption. What is the consolidated debt ratio, she asked. Thomas Berger answered without hesitation, approximately 21%. Most liabilities are tied to development leverage with fixed-rate structures. Exposure is limited. Adjustable instruments. Minimal. Where present, they are hedged. Greta nodded. She did not comment. She did not express approval. She simply continued reading, because what mattered was not whether the structure appeared stable. It was whether it remained stable under scrutiny. Daniel watched her for a moment before speaking again. You're approaching this as a system, he said. Greta looked up briefly. It is a system. He inclined his head slightly. Most beneficiaries don't begin there. Most beneficiaries aren't expected to maintain it, she replied. There was no challenge in her tone, only clarity. The distinction mattered. Margaret turned to another section. There are active negotiations in two major developments, Chicago and Seattle, that may require executive-level decisions within the next 30 days. Summaries, Greta asked. In Section 4, Greta flipped to the tab. Reviewed. Closed it. Hold all major decisions until I complete full review. Thomas made a note. Understood. The rhythm of the meeting shifted, then not in authority but in alignment. They no longer spoke as though guiding her through something unfamiliar. They adjusted almost imperceptibly to a different expectation that Greta would not need explanation, only access. Daniel reached for a separate document. There is a personal clause included by Eleanor, he said. He placed a single sheet in front of her. It was not formatted like the others. No legal structure, no numbered sections, just a letter. Greta read it without interruption. Greta, if you are reading this, then the timing has aligned in a way I anticipated, though not necessarily preferred. You were never meant to inherit this because you asked for it. You were meant to inherit it because you would not misuse it. There is a difference between ownership and display. Most people never learn it. Do not correct those who underestimate you, unless it serves a purpose. Do not reveal more than is required, and do not assume that silence is the absence of control. You have always understood more than you have said. That is why this is yours. Eleanor Greta finished reading and placed the paper back on the table, aligning it with the edge of the binder. She did not fold it, did not comment. The room remained quiet, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition that the letter did not require discussion. What are the immediate legal exposures? She asked. Margaret responded. Minimal. The portfolio is stable. There are no active litigations that present significant risk. However, transition periods often attract scrutiny internally and externally. Internal oversight. 2 senior trustees. Neither has been informed of the beneficiary identity yet. Timeline for disclosure. Within 14 days. Greta considered that briefly. They're informed after I review executive performance reports. Thomas nodded. We can prepare those within 48 hours. Do that. Again, no emphasis. No assertion. Just placement. Because authority, when understood, does not need to be announced. The meeting continued for another hour, moving through sections that detailed operational continuity, regulatory obligations, and communication protocols during the confidentiality window. Greta asked questions when necessary. Not many, but each one precise enough to refine the structure in front of her. When the meeting concluded, Daniel Reeves walked her to the elevator. Eleanor chose carefully, he said. It was not flattery. It was observation. Greta glanced at him. She chose function, she replied. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. As they closed, Daniel understood something that had likely been clear to Eleanor for years. Greta would not expand the empire impulsively, nor would she dismantle it out of sentiment. She would understand it, and in understanding it, she would maintain it. Across the country, Dominic Hale was standing in front of a property he had already shown twice that week, adjusting his tone slightly as he repeated a pitch that had become more performance than information. It's about timing, he said, gesturing toward the open layout as though the space itself confirmed his point. You don't wait for perfect conditions, you position yourself ahead of them. The client nodded, though, without commitment. Dominic smiled anyway. Confidence filled gaps that certainty could not. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A message from Greta landed. "We'll be here a few days." No details. No elaboration. Dominic typed a response quickly. "Good. Let me know if anything comes up." He did not ask about the will. Did not ask what she had inherited. Because in his mind, the answer had already been categorized. Something modest. Something supplemental. Something useful. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued speaking, unaware that the structure he believed defined success, ownership, leverage control, had just shifted entirely, and without announcement, into the hands of someone he had already begun to overlook. That evening, Greta sat alone in her hotel room, the binder open once more in front of her. Understanding for her was not achieved through a single review. It required repetition, verification, cross-reference. She opened her laptop and began aligning the internal documents with public filings, SEC disclosures, property records, tax documentation. Everything matched. No inflation. No concealed liabilities. Eleanor had not built an illusion. She had built something that could withstand examination. Greta closed the binder. Then she created a new folder, Halvorson and Blythe Transition. Inside, she established structure, executive reports, legal framework, financial mapping, risk assessment, internal communications. Each folder empty for now, each one necessary. Then she created another, separate, unrelated on the surface. She paused for a moment before naming it, then typed Personal California. Inside, she began placing what she had already collected over the past year. Bank statements, access logs, recorded inconsistencies, emails, conversations documented with exact phrasing. Dominic Hale, not as a husband, as a variable within a system that had not yet fully revealed its implications. She did not assign meaning, not yet, because meaning when applied too early distorts structure. And Greta was not interested in distortion. She was interested in clarity. She saved the folder, closed the laptop, and sat for a moment in the quiet of a room that contained nothing personal, nothing familiar, only space. Because everything that mattered was no longer tied to where she was. It was tied to what she understood. And Greta Halvorson had begun to understand more than anyone around her had yet realized. When Greta Halvorson returned to California, nothing in the house had changed, and that more than anything clarified what had. The structure of a shared life often disguises its own fragility through repetition. The same hallway, the same arrangement of objects, the same quiet hum of appliances that continue functioning regardless of what shifts beneath them. Continuity creates the illusion of stability. Greta understood that illusion. She stepped inside just after sunset, her key still fitting the lock without resistance, the mechanism turning as it always had. For a moment, there was no indication that anything within the walls had moved out of alignment, but she no longer evaluated environments by appearance, only by structure. Dominic Hale was in the living room, seated with the casual sprawl of someone who believed himself to be at the center of whatever space he occupied. His phone was in his hand, angled slightly away, not concealed, but not offered. He glanced up as she entered. "Hey," he said, as though her return had been expected in form, but not in detail. That was all she offered. He watched her for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for elaboration, but when none came, he shifted his attention back to the device in his hand. Greta set her suitcase down near the hallway wall, placing it exactly where it would not interrupt the path through the house. She removed her shoes, aligning them beside the others, with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. Nothing out of place. Nothing announced. "New York, okay?" Dominic asked, still not looking directly at her. It was efficient. He smiled faintly at that, as if confirming something he had already assumed. "You always say that," he replied. "Everything's either efficient or not worth mentioning." Greta did not respond. Because for her, that was not a dismissal. It was a standard. Dominic stood, stretching slightly, then walked into the kitchen as though continuing a routine that had never been interrupted. "So," he said, opening the refrigerator. "What did you find out?" Greta followed, not out of obligation, but because the conversation had moved there. "The estate is being processed." Dominic closed the refrigerator door with a soft push. "That's vague." It's accurate. He leaned back against the counter, folding his arms in a way that suggested patience rather than pressure, though the distinction was often superficial. So you don't know yet. Like what she left you, I know what's relevant. And what's that? That it requires time. Dominic exhaled through his nose, a subtle indication of dissatisfaction. Well, he said after a moment, hopefully it's something we can actually use. The word appeared again. Use. Greta observed it without acknowledging it, because the difference between how Dominic defined value and how she did had already begun to separate into distinct, incompatible frameworks. I'll let you know when it's finalized, she said. Dominic nodded, not because he agreed, but because he had already reached his own conclusion. Something modest. Something supplemental. Something that might ease the pressure he had begun to feel, though he had not yet named it that. Good, he said. That would help. Greta did not ask how, because she already intended to find out. The next morning, Greta resumed her routine. There was no visible transition, no external adjustment that would signal change to anyone observing from the outside. She woke at the same time, prepared coffee in the same measured sequence, and left for work with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her movements long before anything had shifted. But internally, the structure had expanded. There was now a second system running parallel to the first one that required equal attention, equal precision, and a different kind of awareness. At 10:12 a.m., she logged into their joint financial account. Access had been modified, not removed, reduced. That detail mattered. She did not react. Instead, she opened a new document. Financial activity joint account. She entered date, time, access level. Then she began to review. The transactions from the past 3 weeks did not present themselves as anomalies at first glance. Each individual charge could be explained within a reasonable context: dinners, travel, business-related expenses. But Greta did not evaluate transactions individually. She evaluated them relationally. Patterns emerged. High-end restaurant charges clustered within specific time frames. Recurring payments to a boutique hotel in Newport Beach. Transportation logs that did not align with Dominic's stated schedule. She exported the data, saved it. Then she cross-referenced timestamps against the fragments of Dominic's calendar that remained visible to her. There were overlaps. Events that could not logically coexist. 2 locations. 1 time. Greta noted it. Not as evidence. Not yet. As inconsistency. That evening, Dominic returned later than usual. 7:48 p.m. His movements were slightly delayed, as though his attention had not fully returned with him. There was a scent, subtle, unfamiliar, not strong enough to identify, but distinct enough to register as external. Greta noticed. She did not comment. Hey, he said, dropping his keys onto the counter with a soft, habitual motion. Long day. Yes. He washed his hands, glanced at his phone, then looked at her. I've got a new client, he said. Big one. Greta met his gaze briefly. What kind of property? Mixed use? Early stage development. Where's San Diego? The answer arrived without hesitation. Greta nodded. That's good. It was neither agreement nor endorsement, just acknowledgement. They ate in relative silence, the kind that does not signal tension so much as the absence of shared engagement. Dominic spoke intermittently, describing potential timelines, projections, language that suggested proximity to success without committing to specifics. Greta listened. Later that night, after Dominic had gone to bed, she opened her laptop. Development filings. Permit applications. The project existed, but it was not early stage, and it was not accessible to someone in Dominic's position. She saved the information, placed it alongside his statement. No annotation, no conclusion, because meaning when forced too early becomes unreliable. 3 days later, a name appeared, not in conversation, in a notification, a calendar entry Dominic had failed to conceal. Dinner. Lena Cross. Greta opened it. Time, location, no additional context. She searched the name. Lena Cross, marketing consultant, real estate branding, Orange County. Public profiles provided enough. Recent collaborations, event photographs. In one image, partially obscured in the background, Dominic stood beside her, not positioned, not introduced, but present. Greta saved the image. Again, no commentary, only placement. That evening, Dominic mentioned a networking dinner. Client-related, he said. Greta nodded. What time? 7. Where? Newport. Just a place by the water. She did not ask which one. She already knew. After he left, Greta opened a new folder, External Cross-Reference. Inside, she organized calendar entries, transaction logs, public records, visual confirmation. She aligned them chronologically, not to prove, to remove uncertainty. Because uncertainty allows interpretation, structure eliminates it. At 1:39 p.m., Dominic returned. Earlier than the last few nights. Later than the timeline he had implied. His phone vibrated as he entered. He checked it, did not respond. Good night, Greta asked. Yeah, he said. Productive. She nodded. Good. He paused, for a fraction of a second as though expecting something further, a question perhaps, or a shift in tone. There was none. He went to bed. The next morning, Greta opened a separate bank account. Not hidden, not deceptive, simply independent. She transferred a small amount from her personal income, nothing significant enough to trigger concern, nothing irregular, just enough to establish separation. She documented the transaction, saved the confirmation. Then she drafted an email. To Charles Whitaker, subject, California Preliminary Financial Separation Review Message. Initiating structured review of joint and personal financial alignment. No immediate action required. Will advise when intervention becomes necessary. G. Halvorson. The reply came within the hour. Understood. Standing by. Greta closed her laptop. She stood in the center of the house for a moment, not as someone uncertain of her place within it, but as someone recalibrating what that place meant. The walls had not changed. The ownership on paper had not yet been challenged. But the structure, the invisible alignment that determines stability, had begun to shift. Not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through accumulation. Data, patterns, discrepancies. And Greta Halvorson, who had spent years ensuring that records remained intact under pressure, now applied that same discipline to something far less predictable than documents: people. Because eventually, when enough inconsistency is preserved in the same place, it does not require accusation. It becomes its own explanation. And Greta was patient enough to let that explanation form. By the time the pattern revealed itself fully, Greta Halvorson no longer experienced it as discovery. It was confirmation. There is a difference between suspecting something and recognizing that it has already been established through repetition, alignment, and absence of contradiction. Suspicion invites emotion. Confirmation requires none. Greta did not arrive at that point suddenly. She moved toward it with the same deliberate precision she applied to every system she had ever examined, quietly, without announcement, allowing each piece of information to find its place before considering what it meant. The name Lena Cross appeared more frequently now. Not in conversation, Dominic never offered it directly, but in the spaces between what he said and what could be verified. Calendar entries that disappeared after being viewed. Transactions that clustered around specific locations. Digital traces that suggested proximity without declaration. Greta did not follow Dominic. She did not need to. People reveal themselves through structure long before they do through confession. One evening, while Dominic was in the shower, his phone lit briefly on the counter, an incoming message, the screen illuminating just long enough to register a name before dimming again. Lena. No last name. No context. Just enough. Greta did not pick up the phone. She did not read the message. Because access obtained without structure introduces uncertainty questions about authenticity, timing, interpretation. Instead, she noted the time, 8:17 p.m. Then later she cross-referenced. Restaurant charge. 8:03 p.m., Newport Beach. She saved both entries. Placed them together. No conclusion. Only alignment. The following week, Dominic's schedule became increasingly inconsistent, not in volume but in coherence. He spoke of meetings that did not appear in any shared calendar. He referenced locations that did not align with transaction logs. He described timelines that required physical presence in two places simultaneously. Greta did not correct him. Correction in situations like this often produces refinement rather than truth. People adjust their narratives when challenged. They become more careful, not more honest. Greta preferred unguarded patterns. They were more accurate, One afternoon, Dominic mentioned a property tour scheduled in San Diego. Early morning, he said, scrolling through his phone as he spoke. Client wants to move fast. Greta nodded. What time are you leaving? 6. She acknowledged it without further inquiry. The next morning, she woke at 5:45. Dominic was still asleep. At 6:12, he left. Not with the urgency of someone driving 2 hours south, with the casual pace of someone heading somewhere closer. Greta did not follow. She waited. At 7:03, a charge appeared. Coffee shop, Irvine. She saved it. At 8:26, another. Gas station, Newport Beach. She saved that too. San Diego did not enter the record. Dominic returned that evening with a version of the day that included traffic delays and a client who needed time to think. Greta listened, not because she believed him, but because his words were part of the system now. And systems require complete data sets. The financial layer became clearer next. It often does. Money, unlike language, does not adapt easily to narrative. It moves in defined paths, recorded automatically, time-stamped without bias. Greta reviewed the joint account again, this time extending the window to include the past 2 months. Patterns that had once appeared incidental now aligned. Recurring payments to the same boutique hotel, not consecutive, not predictable, but consistent enough to establish intention. She cross-referenced dates, calendar entries, client dinners, late meetings, networking events. The language varied. The structure did not. Greta created a new document, pattern analysis, financial and schedule alignment. She did not label the pattern. She mapped it. Dates in one column, transactions in another, stated activities beside them. Then she added a fourth column, verification, blank where confirmation was not yet possible, filled where it was. Over time, the blank spaces decreased. Lena Cross became more than a name. She became a variable. Greta approached her the same way she approached any external element within a system, through publicly available information first. Lena's professional profile was consistent. Marketing consultant, specializing in real estate branding, active in Orange County, photographs from industry events, client features, collaborations. Dominic appeared occasionally, not prominently, not intentionally, but present. Greta saved those images, archived them under a new subfolder, external cross-reference, visual confirmation. She did not zoom in, did not enhance, did not analyze beyond what was already visible, because the goal was not to interpret, it was to preserve. One evening, Dominic mentioned Lena directly for the first time. Not as someone significant, as someone useful. I might bring in a marketing consultant for one of the listings, he said, casually scrolling through his phone. She's good with branding. What's her name? Greta asked. Lena. Lena Cross. The addition of the last name came without hesitation. Greta nodded. That makes sense. Dominic glanced at her briefly, perhaps expecting more. There was none. No question about how he knew her. No inquiry into how long they had been working together. Just acknowledgement, because Greta had already moved beyond that stage. The question was no longer who Lena was. It was how she fit into the structure Dominic was maintaining, and how that structure intersected with the one Greta was documenting. That night, Greta expanded her records. She created a new folder. Lena Cross, Associated Data. Inside calendar references financial transactions, public records, visual documentation, direct mentions. She aligned everything chronologically, not to construct a narrative, but to remove the possibility of alternative ones. Because when enough independent data points converge, they no longer require explanation. They define themselves. There was no confrontation. Not then. Not later. Greta did not sit across from Dominic and ask questions whose answers she already understood. She did not present evidence, did not seek confession, because confession in many cases is less reliable than documentation. It is shaped by fear, by self-preservation, by the immediate need to control perception. Records, by contrast, remain unaffected. They do not adapt. They do not retract. They exist. And Greta trusted existence over explanation. At the same time, she began to adjust her own position within the structure. Not outwardly, not in a way that Dominic would recognize, But internally, legally, financially, she opened a separate account as she had planned. Then another, one designated for personal income, another for future allocation. Each one documented, each one aligned with regulations. No concealment, only separation. She reviewed shared liabilities, mortgage, utilities, insurance, all still active, all still connected. For now, she did not change them, not yet, because premature action can destabilize a system before it is fully understood. And Greta was not interested in destabilization. She was interested in precision. There is a moment in any evolving structure when the variables stop shifting unpredictably and begin to settle into defined roles. Dominic had not reached that awareness. He continued to move through his days, with the assumption that control remained where he had always believed it to be within his narrative, his decisions, his ability to shape perception through confidence and omission. Greta had moved beyond that. She no longer evaluated his actions in isolation. She evaluated them as part of a system that was revealing itself with increasing clarity. Financial inconsistency, behavioral deviation, external involvement, all aligned, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. Late one evening, as Greta reviewed her records, she paused not because something new had appeared, but because nothing needed to. The pattern was complete. Not in the sense that every detail had been uncovered, but in the sense that enough had been established to remove uncertainty. Dominic Hale was not where he said he was. He was not using shared resources in the way he claimed. And he was not operating within the structure he had presented. Greta closed the file. Not with finality, but with readiness. Because understanding once achieved does not demand immediate action. It demands correct timing. And Greta Halvorson had always been very precise about when something needed to be done and when it did not. There are moments when pressure does not announce itself through volume, but through insistence, quiet, repeated, increasingly difficult to ignore. It does not arrive as crisis. It arrives as request, and then eventually, as expectation. By the time Dominic Hale began to involve Greta Halvorson directly in his financial strain, he did not present it as strain at all. He framed it, as he often did, as opportunity, something temporary, strategic, requiring only cooperation rather than scrutiny. Greta recognized the difference immediately. Not because of what he said, but because of when he said it. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that settles into a comfortable stillness where time feels less structured and decisions appear less urgent than they actually are. Dominic had chosen that time deliberately, though not consciously. People often do when they want agreement more than examination. He was seated at the dining table, documents spread in front of him, not disorganized but not fully ordered either. Enough to suggest preparation, not enough to withstand detailed review. "Can you take a look at this?" he asked as Greta entered the room. She paused, observing the arrangement before approaching. "What is it?" "Just a refinance option. Temporary. It'll help free up liquidity for a deal I'm working on." Greta pulled out a chair and sat down, her attention already moving toward the documents without urgency, without resistance. "Which property?" she asked. "The house." He said it lightly, as though it were obvious, as though it required no further clarification. Greta did not react immediately. She reached for the top page and began to read. Loan restructuring, adjusted interest terms, extended liability. Her name appeared in multiple sections, not as reference, as requirement. She continued reading, her pace steady, unhurried. "What's the current outstanding balance?" she asked. Dominic shifted slightly. "It's all in there." "I'm asking you." "Then just under 1.4. Greta nodded. "Purpose of refinance, I told you liquidity. I've got a deal that just needs a push to close." "What kind of deal?" Dominic exhaled, not sharply, but with the subtle impatience of someone who believes the question itself is unnecessary. "Greta, it's real estate. It's what I do." "That's not an answer." He leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "It's a development opportunity. Early stage. High return. Location, San Diego." Greta held his gaze for a moment, then returned to the document. Because the answer had already been recorded elsewhere, and it had not matched. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "A few weeks. Maybe less." "And the risk?" Dominic smiled faintly, as though the question had missed the point. "There's always risk." "That's not what I asked." The smile faded just slightly. "It's manageable." Greta closed the document. Not abruptly. Deliberately. Show me the full financials. Dominic hesitated. What do you mean? I mean the deal structure. Investment breakdown. Projected return. Associated liabilities. Not this. She tapped the paper lightly. This is a request, not an explanation. Dominic's expression shifted not into anger but into something closer to resistance. It's not that complicated. Then it should be easy to show. Another pause. Longer this time. Dominic looked at the documents, then back at her. I don't have everything finalized yet, he said. Then it's not ready. It's ready enough. For you, Greta replied. Not for me. The distinction settled between them, quiet but immovable. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his tone adjusting, not louder but more direct. I need you to sign this, Greta. Need. Not ask. Not suggest. Need. Greta did not respond immediately. She looked at the document again, then at the sections where her signature would be required. Not optional. Binding. This was not support. This was transfer. Not of ownership. Of risk. She understood that. Completely. What happens if the deal doesn't close? She asked. It will. That's not what I asked. Dominic exhaled, this time with less restraint. We carry the loan for a while. It's not a big deal. How long? A few months. At what cost? It depends. On what? The market. Greta nodded slowly. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement of the absence of structure. Because everything Dominic had said relied on variables he could not control. Market. Timing. Outcome. And everything he had not said relied on something else entirely. Assumption. Greta placed the document back on the table. I'm not signing this, she said. Her voice was calm. Even. Not defensive. Not confrontational. Simply final. Dominic stared at her for a moment, as though recalibrating something he had not expected to encounter. What? I'm not signing it. Why? Because I don't have enough information to assess the risk. It's not that serious. It is to me. Dominic's tone shifted again, this time carrying the edge of frustration he had not yet needed to express directly. Greta, this is how things work. You leverage assets to move forward. That's the point. That's one way to do it. It's the way everyone does it, not without documentation. Dominic let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. You're overcomplicating this. No, Greta replied. I'm clarifying it. He shook his head, pushing the document slightly toward her. I don't have time to go through all of this right now. I need this signed. Greta did not touch the paper. Then you'll need to find another solution. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It carried weight, not loud, not volatile, but present in a way that could not be dismissed. Dominic leaned back again, his posture no longer relaxed. This affects both of us, he said. It affects me because you're asking me to take on liability, Greta replied. Without transparency. It's temporary. That doesn't reduce the risk. It's manageable, not without information. Dominic's patience began to thin. You trust me, don't you? The question arrived as though it were central, as though the answer would resolve everything else. Greta considered it. Not emotionally, structurally. Trust to her was not a declaration. It was a pattern. And the pattern at this point had already been documented. I rely on what I can verify, she said. Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. That's not an answer. It is to me. Another pause. Longer. He looked at her, searching for something, flexibility perhaps, or the version of Greta who had once accepted explanation in place of structure. He did not find it. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. Greta did not respond, because difficulty in this case was not created by her refusal. It was revealed by it. Dominic gathered the documents, not aggressively but with a controlled motion that suggested containment rather than resolution. Fine, he said. I'll figure it out. Greta nodded. I'm sure you will. There was no challenge in her tone. No doubt. Just acknowledgement, because whether or not Dominic found a solution was no longer something she intended to manage. Later that evening, Greta returned to her records. She opened a new file. Financial Risk Refinance Request. She entered date, time, summary of request, exact phrasing. She attached a scanned copy of the document. Then she added cross-references, existing liabilities, unverified deal claims, inconsistent location statements. No commentary, no conclusion, just structure. Because the request itself was not the issue, the context was. And the context now was complete enough to define a shift. Dominic was no longer operating within shared parameters. He was attempting to extend his system into hers, without alignment, without verification, without consent. Greta saved the file, closed her laptop, and sat for a moment in the quiet that followed, not as someone uncertain but as someone who had reached a point of clarity that did not require immediate action. Because refusal, when placed correctly, is not confrontation. It is boundary. And Greta Halvorson had just established one, without raising her voice, without repeating herself, without leaving room for misinterpretation. The act itself did not take long. There was no extended argument, no escalation that might have warned anyone watching that something irreversible was about to occur. What happened unfolded with a kind of quiet efficiency. Decisions made in advance, actions executed without hesitation, consequences delivered as though they had always been inevitable. Greta Halvorson returned home that evening just after 6:30 p.m. The sky still held light, though it had begun to dim at the edges, the kind of transitional hour where the world appears unchanged even as it moves toward something darker. The street was calm, lined with houses that reflected stability through uniformity. Trimmed hedges, clean driveways, windows that revealed just enough to suggest order without inviting scrutiny. Nothing at first glance appeared different, until she reached the door. The key did not turn. It resisted, not loosely, not as though the mechanism were worn, but firmly, precisely as though it had been replaced. Greta paused, her hand still resting against the lock. There are moments when the absence of access communicates more clearly than any explanation could. She tried once more. The result did not change. Behind her, a car slowed slightly as it passed. Across the street, a curtain shifted. Observation without involvement. Greta stepped back, not in confusion, but in recognition. This had been decided before she arrived. The door opened. Dominic Hale stood in the frame, one hand resting against the edge, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control rather than confrontation. "You should have called," he said. His tone was even, measured, as though the situation required coordination, not justification. Greta met his gaze. The lock was changed. Yes. No explanation, no hesitation, just confirmation. There was a suitcase beside her. She had not placed it there. It stood upright, positioned carefully against the wall, as though someone had considered its placement before stepping away. Greta glanced at it briefly, then back at Dominic. "My things?" she asked. "Just what you need for now," he replied. "For now," a phrase that implied temporary adjustment while establishing immediate exclusion. "Why?" Greta asked. The question was simple, not emotional, not accusatory, structural. Dominic exhaled softly, shifting his weight slightly as though preparing to deliver something he had already decided would not be negotiated. "Because this isn't working," he said, "and I'm not going to keep pretending it is." Greta did not interrupt. He continued, "You've been distant, uncooperative. Everything turns into a process with you. It's exhausting." His voice remained controlled, but there was something beneath it now, not anger exactly, but a need to define the narrative before it could be questioned. "I asked for one thing," he went on. "One signature, and you turned it into this." He gestured vaguely as though the accumulation of Greta's restraint required no specific reference. Greta listened, because what he was saying mattered, not as truth, as position. "And this is your solution?" she asked. Dominic's expression tightened slightly. "This is me setting boundaries." The word settled between them with quiet irony. Boundaries. Redefined. Reassigned. "You're not contributing to this house the way you think you are," he added, his tone shifting just enough to carry something sharper. "And I'm done carrying everything myself." Across the street, the curtain moved again. Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, observers, not participants, Greta noticed. Not because she cared what they saw, but because context matters even when it is unspoken. "This house is in both our names," she said. Dominic smiled faintly. Not warmly. Not kindly. "That's paperwork," he replied. "Reality's different." Greta held his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them did not thicken. It clarified. Because what Dominic had just done was not impulsive. It was deliberate. He had removed her access, redefined ownership, rewritten the structure of their shared life without agreement, and he believed he could sustain that version of reality. "You packed this?" Greta asked, nodding toward the suitcase. "Yes. What did you leave out?" Dominic shrugged slightly. "Nothing important." Greta nodded once. Acknowledgement, not acceptance. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. Dominic's expression shifted again, this time carrying a trace of impatience. "You can figure that out," he said. "You always do." The sentence was meant to dismiss. It revealed something else. Recognition. He knew she was capable. He just did not consider that capability relevant until now. Greta looked at the suitcase, then at the door, then back at Dominic. She did not step forward, did not reach for the handle again. Because access once removed does not return through insistence. It returns through authority, and authority in this moment did not require demonstration. "All right," she said. The word was quiet, complete. Dominic seemed to pause just briefly, as though the absence of resistance had created a gap he had not anticipated. "That's it?" he asked. Greta met his gaze. "What would you like me to add?" He didn't answer, because there was nothing he could add that would justify what had already been done. Greta picked up the suitcase. It was lighter than it should have been. She did not check its contents. Not here. Not now. Because what had been removed mattered less than what had been revealed. She stepped away from the door. The evening air felt unchanged. The street remained quiet. The same houses, the same trimmed hedges, the same stillness. But the structure had shifted, not gradually, completely. Dominic watched her for a moment longer, then closed the door. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. The lock engaged with a soft final click. Greta did not turn back. She walked to her car without urgency, placing the suitcase in the trunk with the same measured precision she applied to everything else. Her movements were neither hurried nor delayed. There was no visible disruption in her behavior, only a quiet adjustment to a new reality that had already begun forming long before this moment. She sat in the driver's seat for a few seconds before starting the engine, not to process, to align, because what had just occurred was not an isolated action. It was the culmination of a pattern: financial control, behavioral inconsistency, external involvement, and now physical exclusion. Each element connected, not emotionally, structurally. Greta started the car. She did not drive far, a hotel less than 15 minutes away. Not chosen for comfort, for proximity. Because distance at this stage would not serve her. She checked in without conversation, took the key card, and entered a room that was indistinguishable from countless others. Neutral, temporary, designed to accommodate presence without attachment. She placed the suitcase on the bed, opened it. Inside were a few changes of clothes, basic necessities. Nothing personal, nothing irreplaceable. Her laptop, however, was there. So was the external drive. Dominic had not taken those. Not because he had chosen not to, because he had not understood their value. Greta closed the suitcase, then opened her laptop. She did not begin with emotion. She began with documentation. New file, incident report, residential access, removal date, time, description. She wrote it exactly as it occurred. No interpretation, no adjectives, just sequence. Then she added context: previous financial request, refusal, behavioral escalation. She attached supporting documents, cross-referenced existing records, everything aligned. Because what had happened was not sudden. It was consistent. Greta saved the file. Then she opened her email. To Rachel Kim, subject: urgent property access and financial review message. Requesting immediate consultation regarding joint property access restriction and associated financial exposure. Documentation prepared. Available tomorrow. Greta Halvorson. She sent it, closed the laptop, and sat for a moment in the quiet that followed. Not in shock, not in disbelief, but in recognition. Because Dominic Hale believed he had just asserted control. He believed he had removed a variable that no longer served his structure. What he had not understood, what he could not yet see, was that in doing so he had created something far more significant than distance. He had created evidence, and Greta Halvorson had always known exactly what to do with that. The hotel room did not attempt to comfort her, and Greta Halvorson did not expect it to. It existed for a single purpose, to provide space without attachment, function without interpretation. Neutral walls, controlled lighting furniture arranged to accommodate movement rather than memory. It was in many ways the ideal environment for what she needed to do next, because what had occurred the previous evening was not in Greta's mind a personal rupture. It was a structural event, and structural events required response, not reaction. She woke early, not out of restlessness, but because clarity once reached tends to organize time more efficiently than uncertainty ever could. At 7:12 a.m. her phone vibrated. A reply. Rachel Kim. Direct, concise. Available 9:30 a.m. Office in Irvine. Bring all documentation. Greta read it once, then again, not for meaning, for confirmation. She closed the message, got dressed, and prepared her materials. Laptop, external drive, printed summaries. Not everything, only what was necessary. Because documentation, like speech, is most effective when it is precise. Rachel Kim's office was located in a building that did not advertise its function aggressively. There were no oversized signs, no unnecessary displays of prestige, just a quiet directory in the lobby, names listed in a format that suggested credibility without requiring attention. Greta arrived at 9:28, 2 minutes early, not to impress, to align. Rachel Kim met her in a conference room that mirrored the same qualities Greta recognized and trusted: order, restraint, efficiency. Rachel was composed, direct, and attentive in a way that suggested she did not rely on volume to establish authority. "Miss Halvorson," she said, extending her hand. "I reviewed your message." Greta nodded. "I brought documentation. I assumed you would." There was no surprise in Rachel's tone, only readiness. They sat. Greta opened her laptop. "I'll walk you through the sequence," she said. Rachel gestured slightly. "Go ahead," Greta began. "Not with the lock, not with the argument, with structure. Joint property ownership," she said, pulling up the title documents. "Both names. Equal legal standing." Rachel leaned forward slightly, scanning. "Confirmed." "Recent financial activity," Greta continued, opening a separate file. "Unilateral decisions. Restricted access. Unverified expenditures." Rachel nodded once. "Continue." Greta moved through the timeline. Not quickly, not slowly, precisely. Each entry aligned with documentation. Each statement supported by record. No interpretation. No emotional framing. Just sequence. When she reached the incident itself, the lock, the removal of access, the suitcase placed outside, she did not change her tone. She described it the same way she described everything else. As fact. Rachel listened without interruption. When Greta finished, the room remained quiet for a moment, not uncertain but complete. Rachel closed the file in front of her. "All right," she said. "Let's clarify your position." Greta nodded. "You are a legal co-owner of the property," Rachel continued, "which means he cannot unilaterally deny you access. What he did is not just inappropriate, it's actionable." Greta did not react. She already understood that. But understanding internally and establishing it legally were not the same process. "What are the immediate options?" she asked. Rachel leaned back slightly. "First, we can file for immediate restoration of access. That would require him to either provide entry or face legal consequences." Greta considered that. "And second, we escalate. Financial review, asset protection, potential separation proceedings. Based on what you've shown me, there's enough here to justify a full investigation." Greta nodded slowly. "Timeline. If we move today, initial filings can be submitted within 24 to 48 hours. Response time depends on how he reacts." Greta paused, not because she was uncertain, because she was choosing. "Proceed with both," she said. Rachel's expression did not change, but something in the room shifted, not in authority, in direction. "Understood," Rachel replied. "We'll begin immediately." By 11:15 a.m. The first steps had already been initiated. Formal notice prepared. Financial review requested. Documentation secured. Greta did not remain in the office after that. There was nothing more to discuss verbally. Everything else would proceed through structure. Meanwhile, Dominic Hale was in the middle of a conversation he had already begun to lose control of, though he had not yet recognized it. His phone rang at 11:42 a.m. "Unknown number," he answered. Dominic Hale. The voice on the other end was professional, measured. "Mr. Hale, this is Rachel Kim, legal counsel representing Miss Greta Halvorson." There was a pause. Not long, but enough. Dominic straightened slightly. "Okay. I'm contacting you regarding the residential property located in Orange County currently under joint ownership." His grip on the phone tightened. "What about it?" "You have restricted Miss Halvorson's access to the property without legal basis. We are requesting immediate restoration of access, effective today." Dominic let out a short breath. "This is ridiculous. It's my house." "It is jointly owned," Rachel replied, her tone unchanged. "Your actions constitute unlawful exclusion." Dominic's jaw tightened. "She left. She was prevented from entering. That's not how it happened. We have documentation." The sentence settled with a quiet weight. Dominic did not respond immediately, because for the first time something had entered the conversation that he could not adjust through tone or confidence. "Record. What happens if I don't comply?" he asked. Rachel did not hesitate. "Then we proceed with legal action. That includes court intervention, financial review, and potential liability for damages." Dominic exhaled, this time more sharply. "You're overcomplicating this." "No," Rachel replied. "We're formalizing it." There was a brief silence. "Then, you'll receive official documentation within the next few hours," she continued. "I advise you to review it carefully." The call ended. Dominic remained still for a moment, the phone still in his hand. Something had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because until now, everything had existed within his control, his version of events, his ability to define what mattered and what didn't. Now there was something else. Structure. External. Documented. Unaffected by his interpretation. Back at the hotel, Greta received confirmation. Documents filed. Notice delivered. Process initiated. She read each message carefully, then archived them. Not because they were finished, because they had begun. She stood near the window, looking out at a view that did not hold her attention. Because what mattered was not outside. It was already in motion. Legal structure, financial exposure, documented inconsistency, all aligned. Not through confrontation, through process. Greta did not feel satisfaction. That was not part of the structure. She felt alignment. Because everything was now where it needed to be. Dominic had acted. She had responded. And the system once engaged would continue. Not based on who spoke louder. Not based on who appeared more confident. But based on what could be proven. And Greta Halvorson had already ensured that what could be proven would not shift. Legal action once initiated does not move with urgency for the sake of appearance. It moves with precision, and in that precision it reveals more than confrontation ever could. By the second day after Greta Halvorson had filed her initial claims, the structure surrounding Dominic Hale had begun to tighten, not visibly, not in a way that would attract immediate attention from the outside, but internally, where systems respond not to intention, but to documentation. Rachel Kim had requested full financial disclosure, not a summary, not selected statements. Full. And once that request entered formal process, it triggered something Dominic had not accounted for: obligation. He could delay conversation. He could redirect questions. But he could not ignore a legal request without consequence. Greta understood this. She did not need to monitor his reactions directly. She only needed to track the system's response. In Rachel's office, the documents began to accumulate. Bank statements, credit lines, transaction histories. They arrived in batches, some complete, some partial, some clearly organized, others less so. But even inconsistency, when placed within a structured review, becomes useful. Greta sat across from Rachel, reviewing the materials, not as a wife seeking explanation, but as an auditor examining variance. "This account," Greta said, pointing to a series of transfers. "These were not disclosed." Rachel nodded. "They're tied to a secondary line of credit, opened when Rachel checked the timestamp. Approximately 4 months ago." Greta did not react. She noted it. 4 months. That aligned with the first series of irregular transactions she had documented. Was I listed? Greta asked. No. Was I informed? Rachel looked at her. You already know the answer. Greta nodded. Because knowledge in this case was not derived from what had been told. It was derived from what had been omitted. The pattern extended further. Charges that had once appeared isolated now aligned with a broader structure. Recurring payments. Not random. Directed. Consistent in destination, variable in amount. Rachel leaned forward slightly, reviewing the same sequence. These are personal expenditures, she said. Not business-related. Greta did not respond immediately. She cross-referenced the dates with her existing records. Calendar entries. Location discrepancies. Visual confirmation. All aligned. Document them, Greta said. Rachel was already doing so. Already in progress. There was a moment as the data expanded across the table when the distinction between suspicion and evidence dissolved completely. Because what Greta had observed quietly over weeks, patterns, inconsistencies, deviations, was now supported by something external, something formal, something that did not depend on her interpretation. Bank records, timestamps, transactional certainty. Dominic Hale had not just been inconsistent, he had been verifiably so. Do you want to pursue this angle? Rachel asked. The question was neutral, not suggestive, because the decision did not belong to her. Greta considered it. Not in terms of emotion, not in terms of consequence for Dominic, in terms of structure. What does it establish? She asked. Rachel answered without hesitation. Financial misrepresentation, potential misuse of joint funds, strengthens your position significantly. Greta nodded. Then include it. No emphasis, no satisfaction, just alignment. Meanwhile, Dominic was beginning to experience something unfamiliar, not loss, not yet, but resistance. Systems he had previously navigated with ease, banks, lenders, contacts, were no longer responding with the same flexibility. Requests took longer. Approvals stalled. Questions appeared where there had once been assumption. He noticed it, but he did not immediately connect it. Because from his perspective, nothing had fundamentally changed. He had made a decision. He had acted. Greta had left. That should have simplified things. Instead, they were becoming more complicated. The first formal notice arrived at his email at 2:14 p.m. Subject: Request for full financial disclosure, joint asset review. Dominic opened it. Read the first paragraph. Then the second. By the third, his posture had shifted. Because this was no longer a conversation. It was a process. Required documentation. Specified deadlines. Legal language that did not invite interpretation. He scrolled further. Attachments. References. And then a list. Transactions. Dates. Amounts. Locations. He recognized them. Not individually. Collectively. And in that recognition, something else surfaced. Not guilt, not immediately, but awareness. Greta had not been unaware. She had been recording. Dominic leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. This was not what he had expected. He had expected resistance. Maybe argument. Possibly confrontation. Something he could respond to. This was different. Unavoidable. Back in the conference room, Greta reviewed another set of documents. Email correspondence. Internal. Forwarded. Time-stamped. Some of them were brief, others more detailed, but all of them carried something consistent, Dominic's own words. Promises. Statements. Assurances. Many of which did not align with the records now in front of her. Rachel placed one printout slightly closer. You'll want to look at this. Greta read it. An email from Dominic to a lender. He had described his financial position. Confidently. Completely. Incorrectly. Greta did not react. She placed the email beside the bank statements, then beside the refinance request he had asked her to sign. The alignment was immediate. Not forced. Natural. Because inconsistency when repeated across multiple forms does not require interpretation. It defines itself. Audio, Rachel asked. Greta paused, then opened another file. She did not record conversations frequently, only when something shifted. There was one. The evening of the refinance request. She played it. Dominic's voice. Clear. Certain. It's not that serious. It's manageable. Just sign it. The recording ended. Silence followed. Not heavy. Not emotional. Complete. Rachel nodded. That's useful. Greta closed the file. Saved it. Placed it within the structure. Because evidence to be effective must be organized, not just collected. There is a point in any legal process where the narrative that once existed between two people becomes irrelevant, not dismissed, replaced by documentation, by sequence, by proof. Greta had reached that point, not suddenly, but inevitably, because everything she had done, every note, every saved file, every cross-reference had been leading here. Not to confrontation, to clarity. That evening, Greta returned to her hotel room and reviewed the full structure once more. Legal filings, financial records, correspondence, audio, everything aligned. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. Because perfection is not required, consistency is. She closed the laptop, sat for a moment. Not in reflection, in recognition. Because what had once been private, confined to a house, to conversations, to assumptions, was now external, documented, structured, and moving forward without requiring further input from either of them. Dominic had acted. Greta had responded. And now the system would continue. Not based on perception, not based on narrative, but based on what had already been established. And Greta Halvorson had ensured that what had been established would not change. Once a legal process begins to take shape, it does not rely on momentum in the way Dominic Hale understood it. It does not accelerate because someone insists, nor does it pause because someone resists. It proceeds according to structure, measured, deliberate, and indifferent to preference. By the third day, Greta Halvorson's case had moved beyond inquiry. It had entered action. Rachel Kim filed the formal petition that morning. Not as a threat, not as leverage, as record. Legal separation, financial review, immediate restoration of access. Each component placed within its appropriate framework, each supported by documentation that did not require emphasis because it did not rely on interpretation. Greta reviewed the filing before it was submitted, not for validation, for alignment. Dates matched, statements reflected, attachments referenced correctly, nothing exaggerated, nothing omitted, because strength in this context came from precision, not volume. Ready? Rachel asked. Greta nodded. Yes. Rachel submitted the documents. There was no visible shift in the room, no announcement, no moment that marked the transition. But it had occurred, quietly, permanently. Dominic received the notice at 1:07 a.m. He was in his car when the email arrived, parked outside a property he had not yet entered, reviewing messages that had begun to accumulate in a way he could no longer ignore. The subject line was clear. Legal filing notice of action. He opened it, scrolled, then stopped, because the words did not move the way conversation did. They did not adjust to his understanding. They did not allow for reinterpretation. They stated. They defined. They proceeded. Dominic read the first page, then the second. By the third, something unfamiliar entered his awareness, not panic, not yet, but displacement. Because this was no longer a situation he could manage through tone. This was not a conversation. It was a position. Filed, structured, advancing. He read Greta's name, then his, then the descriptions. Joint ownership, financial inconsistency, denial of access. Each point supported, each claim attached to something that existed beyond assertion. Documentation. Dominic closed his eyes briefly. Not to think, to pause, because for the first time the version of events he had been maintaining internally, externally, no longer held primary position. It had been replaced. Back in Rachel's office, Greta sat with the same composure she had maintained from the beginning. Nothing in her posture suggested escalation. Nothing in her expression suggested satisfaction, because what had been filed was not a victory. It was alignment. "What happens next?" she asked. Rachel leaned slightly forward, hands resting on the table. "We wait for response," she said, "and we continue building the record." Greta nodded. Timeline. Initial response within a few days. Court scheduling depends on availability, but the financial review will continue regardless. Greta considered that. And the property he will be formally required to restore access or justify denial. Based on what we have, justification will be difficult. Greta did not comment, because difficulty in this case was not her concern. Accuracy was. Dominic did not respond immediately. He read the notice again, then once more, as though repetition might change its structure. It did not. He called Greta. The phone rang. Once. Twice. She did not answer. He ended the call. Waited. Then tried again. No response. The absence was not accidental. It was structural. Greta had already moved the conversation into a space where direct communication was no longer required. Dominic understood that. But understanding did not resolve it, because he had not yet adjusted to a system in which his access to her, to the situation, to the narrative was no longer immediate. That afternoon, Dominic contacted an attorney, not because he had planned to, because he had to. The consultation was brief, efficient. The attorney reviewed the notice, asked a series of direct questions, and then leaned back slightly. "This is serious," he said. Dominic frowned. "It's being blown out of proportion." The attorney did not respond to that. Instead, he asked, "Did you restrict her access to the property?" Dominic hesitated. "Temporarily." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Yes." The attorney nodded. "Was the property jointly owned?" "Yes." "Did you have legal grounds to deny access?" Dominic shifted slightly. "I mean, it's my house." The attorney held his gaze. "That's not a legal answer." Silence. "Then, no." The attorney exhaled quietly. "Then that's a problem." Dominic leaned forward. "What about the financial stuff? That's just business. Were all accounts disclosed?" "No." "Were joint funds used for personal expenditures?" Dominic didn't answer immediately, because now the questions were no longer abstract. They were aligned, with record. "With documentation, that becomes another problem," the attorney said. Dominic sat back. For the first time, the situation did not feel manageable, because it was no longer defined by what he believed. It was defined by what could be proven. Greta received confirmation of Dominic's legal representation later that evening. Rachel forwarded the notice. "They've retained counsel," she said. Greta read the name. Not unfamiliar, not particularly significant, just another component. "Good," she replied. Rachel glanced at her. "Most clients don't say that." Greta closed the message. "It means the process will be clearer." Rachel allowed a small nod. "That's true, because clarity in legal terms often emerges when both sides are forced into structure. And structure, once established, does not allow for ambiguity to remain unexamined." That night, Greta reviewed her records again, not because something had changed, because everything had. The filing, the response, the involvement of legal representation on both sides. All of it marked a shift from private system to formal process. And formal process required consistency. She checked each document, each timestamp, each reference. Everything aligned. No gaps, no inconsistencies, because she had not allowed any. There is a point in every conflict where control shifts, not through force, not through declaration, but through alignment with structure. Dominic had not recognized that point when it passed. Greta had, because she had prepared for it long before it arrived. Not as strategy, as habit, documentation, verification, precision. She closed her laptop, turned off the light, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Not as someone waiting, as someone who had already moved forward, because the outcome from this point on would not be determined by argument. It would be determined by what had already been established, and Greta Halvorson had ensured that what had been established would not require her to raise her voice to be understood. The first hearing was not designed to resolve anything. It was designed to define. In legal proceedings, definition precedes judgment. Before any decision can be made, the structure must be clarified, positions established, claims, supported responses recorded. It is a process that values sequence over speed, precision over persuasion. Greta Halvorson understood this. Dominic Hale was beginning to. The courtroom was smaller than most people imagined when they thought of legal confrontation. There were no elevated platforms designed for spectacle, no dramatic pauses waiting to be filled with emotional declarations. Just a contained space where language was measured, time was allocated, and everything that mattered had already been written before anyone spoke. Greta arrived early. Not significantly, just enough. She sat beside Rachel Kim, her posture composed, her attention directed not toward the room but toward the documents in front of her. She did not look for Dominic when he entered. Not because she was avoiding him, because his presence in this context was no longer the central variable. The case was, Dominic took his seat across the aisle, accompanied by his attorney, whose movements suggested familiarity with the environment but not complete control over it. He glanced at Greta once, briefly uncertain whether acknowledgement was expected. She did not return the glance. Not out of dismissal. Out of alignment. Because this was no longer a shared space. It was a structured one. When the proceedings began, there was no announcement beyond necessity. Case identification, parties involved, purpose of hearing. Each element stated clearly without emphasis. Rachel spoke first. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. Your Honor, this is a matter of unlawful exclusion from jointly owned property compounded by financial irregularities that require formal review. No adjectives. No dramatization. Just placement. Dominic's attorney responded with a similar structure, though his language carried something different, not inconsistency but absence. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that access was restricted temporarily but disputes the characterization of that action as unlawful exclusion. Additionally, the financial matters referenced are, in our view, misinterpreted business decisions. Misinterpreted. The word entered the record. Greta noted it. Not because it changed anything, because it would be referenced later. The judge did not respond immediately. Instead, she reviewed the documents already submitted. Pages turned. Silence held. Not uncomfortable. Necessary. Because in that silence, everything that had been prepared, every record, every statement, every timestamp was being evaluated not as narrative but as structure. Rachel placed a document forward. Your Honor, Exhibit A, property title, confirming joint ownership. The judge glanced at it briefly. Confirmed. Another document. Exhibit B, timeline of access restriction supported by dated records and communication logs. The judge reviewed it longer. Noted. Then Exhibit C, financial transactions, indicating undisclosed expenditures from joint accounts. This time the review extended. Because this was no longer a question of access, it was a question of alignment. Between what had been stated and what had been done. Dominic shifted slightly in his seat, not visibly enough to draw attention, but enough for Greta to register. Because movement in environments like this often reveals more than speech. His attorney leaned toward him briefly, whispering something that did not reach across the room. Dominic nodded, but the nod lacked certainty. Mr. Hale, the judge said, looking up from the documents, is it your position that you had the legal right to deny access to a jointly owned property? Dominic hesitated. Not long, but long enough. I temporarily, yes, he said. On what legal basis? The question was simple, direct, unavoidable. Dominic glanced at his attorney, then back at the judge. It was a personal situation. That is not a legal basis, the judge replied. The statement was not harsh. It did not need to be. It was definitive. Rachel did not interrupt. She did not press. Because the structure was already doing the work. The record spoke. The questions aligned. And Dominic, for the first time, was required to respond within a framework that did not adjust to him. Your Honor, Rachel continued, we are requesting immediate restoration of access, along with temporary financial protections pending full review. The judge nodded slightly. That is under consideration, Dominic's attorney responded. We request time to review the financial allegations more thoroughly before any further action is taken. Time. The request was expected. The reason was not. Because time in this case did not change the structure. It only delayed its acknowledgement. The judge leaned back slightly, her attention returning to the documents. There will be time for review, she said. However, the matter of property access is immediate. She looked at Dominic. Mr. Hale, you will restore Miss Halvorson's access to the property effective immediately. Failure to comply will result in further legal action. The statement entered the room without emphasis, but it carried finality. Dominic nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Not agreement. Compliance. Greta did not react, not externally, because this was not a moment of resolution. It was a step, one within a sequence that had already been established. The hearing continued. Briefly, procedural details, scheduling, deadlines, each element placed into the structure that would carry the case forward. Then it ended. No conclusion, no closure, just continuation. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the structure had shifted again. Dominic approached, not quickly, not aggressively, carefully, as though unsure of how to position himself within a dynamic he no longer controlled. Greta, he said. She turned. Not immediately, not slowly, at the pace that matched everything else she had done. Yes, he hesitated. There was something he wanted to say, an explanation, a justification, perhaps even a version of events that might restore something that had already moved beyond restoration. This didn't need to go this far, he said. The sentence existed. Incomplete. Greta looked at him, for a moment, not evaluating him, not responding emotionally, just observing. Then, it didn't, she replied. No accusation, no emphasis, just acknowledgement, because escalation in this case had not been driven by her. It had been revealed through his actions. Dominic exhaled. This is being handled wrong. Greta did not respond immediately, because wrong, like misinterpreted, was a word without structure. It required definition, and none had been provided. Everything is being documented, she said. That's not the same as understanding. It is in this context. Dominic shook his head slightly. You're turning this into something it's not. Greta met his gaze. It already is. The conversation ended there, not because there was nothing left to say, because nothing left to say would alter what had already been established. That evening, Greta reviewed the hearing summary Rachel had prepared. Every statement, every response, every directive, all aligned. The judge's order, Dominic's acknowledgement, the continuation of financial review, everything in place. She saved the file, added it to the system, because the system was no longer something she was building. It was something that was now building itself, through process, through record, through structure. And Dominic, for the first time, was no longer outside of it. He was inside it, defined by it, unable to adjust it through anything other than compliance. Greta closed her laptop, sat for a moment in the quiet, not reflecting, not anticipating, just present within the structure that had been established. Because from this point forward, the outcome would not depend on what either of them believed. It would depend on what had already been proven, and Greta Halvorson had ensured that what had been proven would not require interpretation to be understood. The disclosure did not arrive with ceremony. It did not unfold in a room filled with anticipation, nor was it delivered in a way that sought to impress or unsettle. In fact, when the information finally entered the legal record, it did so with the same quiet precision that had defined every step Greta Halvorson had taken up to that point, which was precisely why its impact extended further than anything dramatic might have achieved. It began with a document, not new but newly relevant, filed as part of the expanded financial review, an asset declaration that had until now remained outside the immediate scope of the case. Not hidden, not concealed, but not required. Until it was. Rachel Kim placed the file on the table during a scheduled review session, her tone unchanged. We need to include this, she said. Greta looked at the document, recognized it immediately. Halvorson and Blythe Holdings. Ownership transfer. Primary beneficiary. Her name. She did not react. Is it necessary, she asked. Rachel nodded. It strengthens your position. Significantly. How? It changes the context of financial dependency. It clarifies that you were not reliant on joint assets, and that any claim suggesting otherwise would be inaccurate. Greta considered that. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because what this document represented was not just scale. It was independence. Legal. Financial. Absolute. Include it, she said. Rachel studied her for a brief moment. Once it's filed, it becomes part of the record. I understand. And it will be seen. I understand that too. There was no hesitation, because Greta had not been protecting the information out of fear. She had been timing it. The filing was submitted that afternoon. It did not trigger immediate reaction. Legal systems rarely do. They absorb, process, align, and then when the structure is complete enough to hold it, they reveal. Dominic Hale did not learn about it through conversation. He learned about it through documentation. His attorney received the updated filing and forwarded it with a brief message: "We need to discuss this." Immediately, Dominic opened the attachment. At first, the document did not appear different from the others he had been reviewing over the past days. Legal formatting, structured language references to ownership and assets that he had already begun to navigate with increasing discomfort. Then he saw the name, Halvorson and Blythe Holdings. He frowned slightly, scrolled, then stopped. Because the number did not appear in isolation, it appeared within context. Valuation, estimated total asset control, $50 billion. Dominic read it once, then again. Not because it was unclear, because it did not align with anything he had assumed. He leaned back slowly, the phone still in his hand. There are moments when information does not produce immediate reaction because the mind requires time to reorganize itself around it. This was one of them. Greta. 50 billion. The two did not exist together in his understanding. Not because it was impossible, because it had never been presented. Not to him. Not to anyone. His attorney called. Dominic answered without delay. "You saw it?" the attorney asked. "Yes." A pause. That changes things. Dominic did not respond immediately, because he did not yet know what things meant in this context. "What exactly does it change?" he asked. "Everything," the attorney replied. "Your position, your leverage, your exposure." Dominic's grip on the phone tightened. "She never said anything about this. That's not legally relevant." "It is to me." The attorney exhaled quietly. "I understand. But in this context, what matters is what's documented." And this, he paused briefly, "this is substantial." Dominic looked at the document again, at the numbers, at the structure, at her name. Something shifted. Not in the legal sense, in perception. Because until this moment, Greta had existed within a framework he believed he understood. Quiet, supportive, dependent. Now that framework had collapsed, not through argument, through documentation. News does not need to be public to spread. It only needs to be present within the right systems. Within days, the information reached circles that intersected with Dominic's professional environment. Not formally, not announced, but referenced. A conversation between attorneys, a note within a financial review, a detail mentioned in passing. Halvorson and Blythe. Greta Halvorson. The connection formed, quietly. And once formed, it did not require confirmation to influence perception. Dominic noticed the shift before he fully understood its source. Calls returned more slowly. Conversations carried a different tone, not dismissive, not overtly changed, but adjusted, as though something about him had been reclassified. He could not define it. Not yet, but he felt it. In the next hearing, the document was referenced, not emphasized, not dramatized, simply placed within the record. "Your Honor," Rachel said, "we would like to include Exhibit F Asset Declaration, confirming Ms. Halvorson's independent financial position." The judge reviewed it, not quickly, not slowly, thoroughly, then noted. That was all. No commentary, no visible reaction. Because in a courtroom, impact is not measured by response. It is measured by placement, and this had been placed. Correctly. Dominic sat still as the document passed into the record. He did not look at Greta, not because he chose not to, because he did not yet know how to. The version of her he had understood no longer aligned with the one now defined in front of him, and there was no space within the structure to reconcile that difference immediately. Greta, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Not outwardly, not internally, because nothing about the document altered who she was. It only revealed something she had already known and chosen not to use. Until now. After the hearing, Dominic approached again, this time more slowly, more carefully. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. The question was not accusatory. It was disoriented. Greta looked at him for a moment. Then, "It wasn't necessary." Dominic shook his head slightly. That's not he stopped, because he did not know how to complete the sentence. Not within a structure that no longer supported his assumptions. "It changes things," he said instead. Greta considered that, then replied, "It clarifies them." The distinction settled. Quiet. Irreversible. Dominic exhaled. "You could have just," he began, but stopped again, because whatever he had intended to say belonged to a version of events that no longer existed. Greta did not fill the silence, because clarity does not require completion. That evening she returned to her records, not to update them, to confirm them. Everything remained aligned. The filing, the response, the shift, all consistent. Because the revelation of her inheritance had not altered the structure, it had completed it. There is a difference between power that is displayed and power that is held. Dominic had understood the first. He had built his life around it: presentation, persuasion, perception. Greta had understood the second. She had never needed to display it, only to place it where it would matter. And now, placed within a structure that could not ignore it, that power did exactly what it was meant to do. Not overwhelm, not dominate, clarify. Greta closed her laptop, sat in the quiet, not reflecting, not anticipating, because the shift had already occurred. Not in her, in the system around her. And from this point forward, everything that followed would move according to that shift, without noise, without emphasis, without the need for her to explain it. Judgment, when it finally arrives, rarely carries the weight people expect. It does not descend with finality in the way confrontation does, nor does it resolve every question that led to its necessity. Instead, it settles into place as the natural conclusion of everything that has already been established quietly, precisely, without excess. By the time Greta Halvorson sat in the courtroom for the final decision, there was nothing left to argue, only to confirm. The weeks leading up to that moment had not been dramatic. They had been methodical. Additional documents filed, responses reviewed, financial discrepancies clarified, each step reinforcing what had already been outlined. Dominic Hale's position had not collapsed suddenly. It had narrowed, gradually, until there was no space left for reinterpretation. The courtroom, when they returned, felt no different than it had before. Same arrangement, same quiet structure, same absence of spectacle. But the atmosphere carried something else now, not tension but completion. Rachel Kim sat beside Greta, her posture unchanged. "There won't be surprises today," she said quietly. Greta nodded. "I don't expect any, because expectation at this stage had been replaced by understanding. Everything that would be said had already been written. Everything that would be decided had already been supported." Dominic sat across the room, still, composed but not in the way he had once been. There was less certainty in his posture, now less assumption in the way he occupied space. Not defeated, but adjusted. Because over the course of the process, something had shifted, not just externally but internally. The system had redefined him, and he had begun slowly to recognize it. The judge entered. Proceedings began. No introduction beyond necessity, no delay, because the case no longer required explanation, only resolution. The decision was read, not quickly, not slowly, at a pace that allowed each element to exist clearly before the next was introduced. Regarding the matter of property access, a pause. The court finds that Miss Halvorson's exclusion from jointly owned property was without legal basis. Greta did not react, not because it was insignificant, because it was expected. Immediate and continued access is affirmed. Another pause. Regarding financial review, pages shifted. The documentation provided establishes a pattern of undisclosed expenditures and financial misrepresentation. Dominic remained still. The words did not surprise him. They aligned with what had already been shown. Liability for associated financial obligations will be assigned accordingly. No emphasis, no judgment beyond what had been structured. Regarding asset separation, a final section. Given the evidence presented, the court recognizes Ms. Halvorson's independent financial position and grants primary control over her respective assets. Greta's position did not change. Her hands remained still, her gaze steady, because this was not a moment of gain. It was a confirmation of what had already been hers. The reading concluded. No dramatic pause. No concluding statement beyond "this matter is resolved." And just like that it was. Outside the courtroom there was no crowd waiting. No audience. No reaction. Just the continuation of a world that had never paused for any of it. Greta stepped into the hallway, Rachel beside her. "That's it," Rachel said. Greta nodded. Yes. No relief. No visible release of tension. Because she had not been holding tension, she had been holding structure. And now the structure had completed its function. Rachel studied her for a moment. "You handled this differently than most," she said. Greta glanced at her. "How? Without escalation? Without performance?" Greta considered that briefly. "Escalation doesn't change documentation," she said. Rachel allowed a small nod. That's true. There was nothing more to add, because the process had not required anything more. Dominic exited the courtroom a few minutes later. He did not approach immediately, not as he had before, because whatever remained between them no longer required resolution. It had already been defined. Still, after a moment, he walked toward her. Not with certainty, with intention. "Greta," he said. She turned. Not out of obligation, out of acknowledgement. "Yes." He paused. There were many things he could have said. Explanations, justifications, apologies. But all of them belonged to a structure that no longer existed. "This didn't need to end like this," he said finally. The sentence was quieter than before, less certain. Greta looked at him. Not critically, not emotionally, just clearly. "It didn't," she replied. The same words she had used before, but now they carried completion. Because what had once been possibility was now record. Dominic exhaled. I didn't think he began, then stopped. Because what he had not thought no longer changed anything. Greta did not fill the silence, because silence in this context was not absence. It was conclusion. He nodded once. Not agreement. Recognition. Then stepped back. There was nothing more to say. Greta walked away. Not quickly. Not slowly. At the same measured pace she had maintained from the beginning. Because leaving, like everything else she had done, did not require emphasis. It required alignment. The house remained. The one Dominic had locked her out of. The one she now had full legal access to. She did not return to it that day. Not because she could not. Because she chose not to. Ownership to her was not defined by presence. It was defined by structure. And the structure no longer required her to occupy that space. Instead, she returned to the hotel, packed her things, closed the suitcase with the same quiet precision she had used when she first opened it. There was nothing to leave behind, because everything that mattered had already been carried forward. Before leaving, she opened her laptop one final time. Not to add. To confirm. The files, the records, the documentation, all complete. All aligned. She closed it, turned off the light, and left the room. There was no final moment, no turning point that marked the end. Because the end had not arrived suddenly. It had formed gradually, through action, through response, through structure. Greta Halvorson stepped into a life that had not changed in essence, only in scale. She did not carry satisfaction with her. She did not carry resentment, only clarity. Because what had been resolved was not just a legal matter. It was alignment between what had been said and what had been proven. And once that alignment exists, nothing further is required. There was no announcement when Greta Halvorson stepped into her new role. No press release bearing her name. No carefully constructed introduction designed to position her within a hierarchy she had not asked to join. The transition, like everything else that had defined her path, occurred quietly, documented, structured, and complete long before anyone thought to observe it. Halvorson and Blythe Holdings did not require spectacle. It required continuity. And Greta provided that. The first time she entered the Manhattan office as its controlling owner, nothing in the building acknowledged the shift. The reception desk remained unchanged. The lighting, the arrangement of space, the quiet efficiency of movement, all consistent with what had existed before. Only the access had changed. Doors opened where they had not before. Permissions aligned with her presence. Not visibly. Functionally, Daniel Reeves met her in the same conference room where she had first read the will. "Everything is in place," he said. Greta nodded. "Executive reports prepared." He handed her a binder, thinner than the first, more specific, because now the system did not need to be introduced. It needed to be maintained. Greta reviewed the reports over the next several hours, not as a new owner, as an auditor. Performance metrics, operational summaries, risk assessments, each division presented clearly, each executive accountable within their respective scope. She did not rush, did not skim, because scale does not reduce the need for precision, it increases it. At one point, Daniel spoke. "Most transitions involve restructuring," he said. Greta did not look up. "Why new leadership tends to assert direction?" Greta turned a page. "Direction is already established." Daniel paused. "Then what will you change?" Greta closed the binder briefly. "Not to consider, to clarify. Only what doesn't align. No more, no less." The executive meeting was scheduled for the following day. A small room, limited attendees, senior leadership only. They had been informed of the transition. Not of her, not yet. That was intentional. When Greta entered, there was no immediate recognition. Only observation, assessment, because people in positions of power are accustomed to evaluating new variables before responding to them. Daniel made the introduction. "This is Greta Halvorson. Nothing more. No titles, no elaboration." Because her position did not require explanation, it required confirmation. The room adjusted, subtly. Posture, attention, silence. Greta took her seat. Not at the head of the table, but in a position that did not compete for it. Because authority, when understood, does not need to be displayed spatially. "I've reviewed your reports," she said. Her voice was even, unhurried, no attempt to command attention. It was already present. "Your structures are stable," she continued. "Your risk exposure is within acceptable range. That will remain the expectation. No praise, no criticism, just placement." One of the executives leaned forward slightly. "Will there be changes to leadership?" he asked. Greta looked at him. Not without reason. He nodded, satisfied. Not because he understood her, because he understood the framework. Over the next weeks, Greta's presence within the company remained consistent, predictable, precise. She did not introduce unnecessary initiatives, did not disrupt existing operations, but she observed, reviewed, adjusted, small corrections, minor realignments. Nothing visible from the outside. Everything effective within the system. Because power at this level is not expressed through visible action. It is expressed through sustained alignment. Back in California, the house remained exactly as it had been, unchanged, unoccupied, maintained only as an asset. Greta had not returned, not because she avoided it, because it no longer held function within her structure. Dominic Hale, however, had, for a time, until the financial obligations assigned to him became too defined to ignore. The court's decision had not been punitive. It had been precise. Liabilities aligned with responsibility, debts assigned accordingly. Dominic adjusted. Gradually, because adjustment, unlike resistance, operates within constraint. There were no further conversations between them, none required. Everything that had existed between them had been documented, processed, and concluded. Not emotionally, structurally. And structure, once resolved, does not revisit itself without cause. Months later, Greta walked through one of the properties held by Halvorson and Blythe. A commercial building in Chicago, glass exterior, clean lines, function over display. She moved through it without announcement, accompanied only by a regional manager who provided details when necessary and remained silent when not. "Occupancy rate?" she asked. 93%, projected 96 within the quarter. Greta nodded. "Good." They continued. No excess conversation. no attempt to impress, because the building, like everything else within the system, existed not to be seen, but to function. At one point, Greta stopped near a window overlooking the city. Not for long, just enough. The skyline reflected back in the glass, structured, layered, persistent. She did not think about Dominic. Not because she had chosen not to, because there was no remaining connection that required consideration. What had happened had been resolved, not through confrontation, through alignment. There is a difference between leaving and moving forward. Leaving implies something unfinished, something abandoned. Moving forward requires neither. Greta had not left anything behind. She had carried everything necessary with her. Documentation, clarity, structure, and with those she had built something that did not depend on what had been, only on what was. She stepped away from the window, continued through the building. The manager followed. The system remained intact, operational, aligned. No one in the lobby recognized her as she exited. No one paused. No one observed. And that more than anything reflected the nature of what she had become. Not visible, not announced, but present in every structure that continued to function exactly as it should. Because Greta Halvorson had never needed to be seen to hold power. She had only needed to understand where to place it. And once placed, it did not need to be explained. The city continued. The buildings remained. The systems operated. And Greta moved within them. Quietly. Precisely. Completely. In the end, what remains is rarely what was said, or even what was done in the moments that felt the most visible. What remains is structure, the quiet accumulation of choices, records, and decisions that over time define not just what happened, but what could not be undone. Greta Halvorson never raised her voice. She never needed to. Because clarity does not compete with noise. It replaces it. And once it does everything else, assumption, perception, narrative falls into place around it. There will always be moments when silence is mistaken for weakness, when restraint is interpreted as absence, when someone is underestimated simply because they do not announce what they are capable of. But those moments are temporary. Structure is not. So if you've ever seen someone remain quiet while everything around them misunderstood their strength, this story was never about surprise. It was about timing, and about knowing exactly when something no longer needs to be said. If this stayed with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always interesting to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that real strength doesn't need attention to exist, you can stay connected quietly by subscribing. There are more stories like this, and they unfold the same way, slowly, precisely, and completely.